What is the function of the symbol of the World Tree? It is not only the story behind the origin of man, but it's also a symbol of completeness to humanity itself. It's been linked to female symbology in various cultures because it is of origin of birth and has connections to the mother archetype. Ergo, Mother Earth. Welcome to Mind Out Podcast. Thank you for tuning in. We appreciate everybody out there and are excited by all of the hits on our podcast through the various apps and media out there that carries it. So thanks a lot for that. I do want to say that we have paired with Patreon. If you find this podcast valuable in any way, you can make a small donation, a minute or a larger amount, it doesn't matter. There is a section in our Patreon page to where if you're a member of a certain amount each month or one time, that will give 50% to Native American charities. As many people probably don't realize, there is so much poverty on the reservations across the United States that any amount would help, and we would be glad to donate that and try to help out as much as we can with the folks here at home. There are a lot of charities that even church organizations utilize that go overseas or spend elaborate amounts of money on trips and to go to other countries, but we've got that right here at home, and I think a lot of people just don't understand that. But anyway, check out our Patreon page again. Like, if you find the content likable, and just donate if you can. If you can't, it's okay. There's plenty of apps. This podcast is free that you can get on the apps, so it's okay. Anyway, we're going to dig right in to this episode, number 10, on the World Tree. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to tell a friend. You can email us if you'd like at mindoutpodcast@gmail.com. You can check out our Twitter page, or you can follow us on Facebook, on our Facebook group page with the same name. I post updates randomly when I'm working on research or combing for topics. I like to hear feedback, and I've gotten some feedback from folks, and I appreciate that too. So again, look us up. If you're interested, we should be launching a web page at some point this year. I'll come up with some updates on that. But for now, let's get into this podcast episode. So getting back into the symbolism of the tree, the World Tree, an unmistakable motif, I guess you could say, of various cultures throughout the world. There's even, tree worship, which you don't hear about much these days. Dendrolatry is, I believe, what it's referred to. And that's kind of the tendency of societies throughout history to worship and like make myths from trees. They play an important role in a lot of different mythologies and religions. They've been given a lot of meaning through the ages and are seen as strong and powerful and wise and sheltering, nurturing. I believe it was Carl Jung that had talked about, the flowing branches and the limbs were more female oriented, and then the heavy trunk was more male, kind of dominant type of symbology of the tree. Even some cultures and religions, like the Druids, would be having their rites and their rituals held in like a grove. If you're Alex Jones, maybe Bohemian Grove might have been where one would be held at. If you haven't seen that YouTube clip, you probably never will, since they kicked him off air. But anyway, that was kind of I guess a Druidic tradition that a lot of upper echelon politicians and rich people would go to every year and do this mock sacrifice to Moloch, the owl god, and just all kinds of stuff. So anyway, just kind of off topic, but anyway, the groves and the areas in the woods where they would have their rituals, and I think you could see that they were more of kind of a paganistic type of order that they would have, and all centered around the World Tree. Whether they knew that or not, that's what was going on. So I'd already said it's a female symbol and a male symbol, kind of an androgynous type of mixture of the two. It's an unmistakable phallic symbol. It just is. And even according to the alchemists in hundreds of years back, prior to science and whatever else, they were trying to find some type of meaning and mixing chemicals, and it wasn't all about turning lead into gold, which that was, I think, what a lot of people think when they hear alchemy. But it was also the alchemist himself, when bringing a conscious awakening or a spiritual awakening through the physical elements, because they wanted to see how the two were connected. We have a spiritual part of ourselves and a physical part, and they wanted to see what held those two things together. But for alchemy, it was a correlate of a union of opposites. So even with alchemy, it was kind of mythologized even back to prehistory, that it was still kind of the same thing. These guys didn't realize that they were following the same path, just through the elements. And this is where anima and animus come together as a complete and equal pair of opposites, uniting consciousness and unconsciousness. And this is where we see the foundations of the tenets of what later would turn out to be the psychoanalytic thought. That healing comes from what leads the patient beyond himself and beyond his entanglement in the ego. The union of the two, of the opposites, could bring an understanding. Once a person realized the unconscious material that's brought to the surface and understood. So even the analysts saw the importance of this great symbol, and their undertaking of this information was heavily influenced by the search for understanding, just like the alchemists before them. In many of these ancient motifs, they didn't just come up with these theories out of thin air. the current symbol, the tree, is present in many cultures with different variations. That this symbol, just like any other, according to Joseph Campbell, he kind of categorized the four functions of what a myth serves. And so this one's no different than any other, that it served a mystical function that kind of opens up a realization of the mystical dimension. And secondly, an image of the world or a cosmological function that changes radically from time to time. So we see the myths evolve, we see the stories evolve. From early hunter-gatherer societies where the world to them was relatively small. They didn't travel like we do today. You might have nomadic cultures that followed herds of animals as they migrated back and forth, but that was about the extent of the world to them. So a lot of these stories and motifs were important because a lot of it centered around what their understanding of the universe was on a very elemental level, in an elementary sense. That it's such a small size of the horizon, the visible world, the sun up, the moon up, the sun down, and like I said, in the cosmological function, Copernicus came and changed all of that for everybody. That the Earth wasn't the center of the universe anymore, and the motif of the World Tree wasn't the world axis anymore, because we found out that there's more to the universe than just us on the Earth, and it's a very elementary idea. Similar to childhood, like you'd see like what's termed as like childhood narcissism, not derogatory in any way, but just how a child just understands the world through himself as being the center of it. And that's kind of what we saw. It's kind of what this axis hinges on for all of us. And back then, it was more of a truth than it was a myth. So the third function would be the sociological, and that would be to kind of validate and maintain the belief in a certain specific, like social order or social sense, right here and now in this society that we have, or anybody would have had or will have. And then lastly, the pedagogical, that's guiding the individual harmoniously through the inevitable crises that happen of the stages of life. And what, better way to see the stages in life is to watch a tree grow. I mean, it's pretty obvious to see it, how it goes through old age and starts to wither and come down, and the nuts fall off and they grow new ones, and it's kind of a cycle that continues. And for us, it's in terms of goods and values and dangers, and how we see ourselves go through anything that guides the individual. So getting back just to this motif, and I'll say this is, where I was leaving off about the analyst is, this is exactly why analysts like Freud and Jung and Otto Rank and many others continue to remain relevant today, is because they didn't just come up with these theories by themselves or try to create something new to sway people to their logic of thinking. Like, they borrowed these ideas and just expounded on them through a more personal sense. And that's why, people like Freud and Jung haven't gone away, that it's still relevant because these are the fundamental precepts of who we are as a people. And so centuries back, millennia back, one of the stories was of the World Tree known as Yggdrasil. And it was the center of the universe in Norse mythology. And it was existing between realms of God and men, gods and men. I think this is where J.R.R. Tolkien had borrowed some of the 9 different levels in Norse mythology of the World Tree. And I'm not going to get into all of those, but he did, there was like elves, and there were just different types of creatures and people. And this is where he kind of got his groove in there and started writing about things that, were taught as truth at some point. And in this mythology, in the Norse mythology, there's a well at the base of the tree, and all those who drink from the well attain wisdom. And there was a guy that stood there, or maybe not a guy, but an entity that stood there named Mimir, and that's where Odin came to drink. And I'm sure many people have heard of Odin, and that's where he comes from, this Norse legend. And Mimir required him to gouge one of his eyes out if he wanted to drink from this fountain and gain wisdom. And he did. And that brings us to his, like, a first sacrifice that he had made. Being able to put off something useful, something highly important to gain. And that's kind of what we all do in our lives. We kind of put things off, cast things aside, even though it's something that we use heavily in order to gain in the long run. That's how we evolve as people. And at the base of the tree, there was also a serpent named Nihogr, and I'm probably just totally blowing these names out of the water, but he gnaws at the root of the tree. It's a serpent, and he's doing damage down in the lower levels in the abyss. And at the opposite side, at the top of the tree, there's an eagle. And what in many motifs see the eagle as like a god, or like a Zeus character, somebody up in the heavens, because this tree is enormous. And the two are bitter enemies, so the serpent and the eagle on opposite ends. Remember, we're talking about the union of these two things. And how I'll get into the more personalization of what the tree is later, but there's also in this mythology, which I thought was funny, because I put some bird feeders out last week. I'm just totally throwing the whole storyline off. And these squirrels got into them, and I was having all kinds of trouble with that. And so when I read about this little like demon character, so there's a squirrel that runs back and forth between the eagle and the serpent, and constantly causes trouble in this myth. And he gets them going back and forth against each other, causing drama and causing like all kinds of hell between the two. And it keeps it going, and it keeps an existing problem. That when I thought about it, that this squirrel is very symbolic of the ego. As our unconscious problems rise up, maybe that we're unaware of, to the level of awareness of the eagle. So you see this eagle as like the all-seeing eye of Horus, the falcon in Egyptian mythology. Like, that's what the third eye, came from. So it's this conscious idealization, this understanding of something, is what that embodies, what this eagle represents. So when you pair the two, you have the level of awareness of this unconscious content that's coming up. And as a person, most of the time, probably majority of the time, we don't get to determine whether we want that unconscious content to come up. It just does. And then, again, unconsciously, we can suppress this damaging serpent, if you will, to where, it can come up later. And the squirrel is a symbol of the trickster, like the coyote and many other cultures and stories, that it keeps it going, that it keeps it alive. But what we've got to do in this symbolic network of things that are happening inside of us, because the tree is a symbol of the self, that we've got to integrate this unconscious material that comes to the surface rather than repressing it, because that's where hell comes from. It comes from within. It's the things that are lurking under the surface in the abyss. And the well that's mentioned is unconscious in a collective sense as well. So in a collective sense, we will never understand consciously some of the things that are happening because it's on a fundamental human level that's beyond what we know, that comes with what used to be called a phylogenetic inheritance. So it's passing on of genetic traits or information from, back from the Stone Ages. And I think it's interesting too that since the tree is a symbol of the self and the serpent's at the bottom, how back prior to the Stone Ages, in evolutionary terms, us living in trees at one point, our conscious mind is it's very young, and our unconscious mind is very, very old. And so through millennia of evolution, and living in trees at some point, why would we not be afraid of the snake at the base of the tree? Speaking in those terms. In the collective unconscious, this well, this deep abyss that nobody knows what's going on underneath, that there's layers in this unconsciousness, this shadow self that we have. It's psychic activity that goes on independently and is, I would say perhaps, but definitely untouchable by personal experience. Through these motifs, we can understand it. We can see it for what it is, but we can only understand part of it because, we just haven't evolved enough, I guess. I heard one researcher say that if you took time and you laid it on the ground in a measure of distance of about 88 feet, and I don't know why I used that, but I think it was because the measurement of this. So if you laid on the ground a measurement of 88 feet, humanity would rest on that line as the width of a business card. And that's how modern anatomic humans, that's how long we've been around in the grand scheme of things. And I found that very interesting. So we've got all this time prior to conscious knowledge that have gone into our evolution of where we came from. from single-celled organisms on up to today. And that's why I said these lower levels of unconsciousness, this collective identity, is something that we won't be able to touch yet. We can understand some of it. But what we can understand and what we're aware of, the shadow or the unconscious, it's the same thing, promotes individuation, which is, becoming a whole person. And succumbing to the shadow leads to disintegration on a psychic level. That can lead to what we understand as psychosis, just this falling out of consciousness. And what Carl Jung had said, that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your path, and you will call it fate. So, and that's why I said we can repress this stuff back down, and then we just believe it's just fate directing us, which I find very interesting. Just how many people believe, like, well, it's just meant to be this way, or it's, have a belief that, well, this is all in God's plan because I have no way of taking personal responsibility of anything. And that's kind of like what would be termed as like fatalism. That it's something external, that this external locus of the control that we have in our lives versus an internal, which tells us that we have the drive and we can make the choices. Now, I'm not going to touch on a lot of this, but there are shamanic traditions within the World Tree, and they have been practiced and recorded throughout recent history of the old traditions, and some of the traditions are oral, so they're still alive today in some cultures, but in some traditions there was a shamanic world tree, and so the shaman would climb the tree in search of enlightenment, or whatever you want to call it. He would meet spirits on his journey up to the top of the tree, and once he got up there, he could, it's almost like almost like a vision quest. The vision quest isn't something that's reserved for the shaman. It's more for everybody to find out what path they should be on in life. But this search for, enlightenment, or being able to communicate with the spirits and learn and direct oneself, set the course for one, for the shaman. That's what they would do, is climb the tree and try and connect, on a level that's beyond them. Which it's important, I think, because you can see this across other cultures too. And I may catch some slack for this because this is just speculation. But the story of Moses and the burning bush in the Bible, some people speculate that the burning bush was an acacia tree, which is a psychedelic plant. So to me, that makes sense that, if this story was an actual, non-metaphor story, that this psychedelic compound could have allowed Moses' spirit to awaken because God talked to him. And we see that with a lot of, I don't want to say psychedelic, maybe hallucinogenic compounds like ayahuasca or mushrooms, which are both used as sacraments in worship in like Peruvian cultures. You've got peyote that's used with the Native American church, which I've referenced before, and mushrooms, with the Aztecs and other cultures through time. And there's many others too. So these things play a part in spirituality as well. And, we hear a lot more today. I mean, hell, Colorado just legalized psilocybin, and I believe one place in California did too. I don't want to say Colorado did, but I guess it was maybe Denver. I'll have to double check on that. But people see these things as material that can remove the ego and help people to better understand how to connect to something bigger than themselves. And it's been a shame that it's been such a long time in the United States that people haven't been able to utilize these as ways to grow the self. Because I think it leads back into this understanding the unconscious aspect of ourselves, that we've got the ego that's our compass rose that tells us where to go. And if that gets altered by a compound that we could have an awakening experience from, man, what's wrong with that, So anyway, that leads back a little bit into the shamanic tradition of the World Tree, that there's something that can still be found today by utilizing the traditional hallucinogenic, compounds. And then you have also the staff of Moses that he used, that he struck the rock and got water to feed his people with. You have the bident that Hades had, another symbol of power. Because, like I said, this is a phallic symbol too. The trident of Poseidon, the magic wand, if you're a Harry Potter fan or whatever. And then you've also got Odin, who was hung on a tree, in addition to Christ, that was hung on a tree, and they were both wounded by a spear while they were hung on the tree, which is kind of a double meaning behind the World Tree and the self and the ego and all that stuff wrapped together. And there was actually a writing about Odin and the tree of Odin, and he was known to have said, and I quote, "I ween that I hung on the windy tree, hung there for nights full 9. With the spear I was wounded, and offered I was to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree that none may ever know what ruth beneath it runs." So it was a sacrifice, just as with Christ, as his self unto his self, and his self is considered the body of Christ, which is the people who worship Christ, or who at that time worshipped Odin in this tradition. That it's not just a tree of life, but it's also a tree of death, and that the two that Joseph Campbell identified was a union of opposites. But Carl Jung took that a step further, not of Campbell's work, but of the motif itself, with the union of opposites of male and female, because Jung, in his studies in alchemy, was that Christ was the lapis, he called it, Lapis. You can look that up if you want on Google or wherever. That he was a all male and all female divine individual, and he was the true symbol of self, because he could link man and woman together in the same inhabitant body, that it was both infallible as male and female. And there was an old legend too that that the wood of the cross was formed from part of the tree of life, from the Garden of Eden, and that Christ was also referred as Logos and also as the sword. And these are two other symbols. So Logos just means word. And I find it interesting that, even back in history, the tree is mentioned as something that's wise, or something that you can gain wisdom from, because I guess it sits at this well of this unconscious knowledge that you can go to. But I find it fascinating that books happen to be made from trees, and where have we gotten knowledge from all these years? And this was, a lot of these old stories were pre paper making type of stories. So we've always written on skins and stuff like that, but I just thought that was something that was interesting in my study in this. It's mentioned too that Christ was the sword, and even a double-edged sword. It mentions in the Bible, and that there was a story by Gerhard Dorn, and his writings indicated that God had determined to snatch the sword of his wrath from the hands of the angel. So when Adam and Eve got booted out of the Garden of Eden, God placed an angel there with a sword that they couldn't come back and have access to the tree of life, because then they would be fallible and they would live forever, and he couldn't have the two, meet together. But God substituted the sword that he took from the angel in place of a 3-pronged hook of gold, and hung the sword on the tree. And so God's wrath is turned into love through that, because Christ is the sword, which symbolizes God's wrath, but yet it was replaced by an equal amount of love through his sacrifice that he made. So, and you can read on too in other areas in the Bible that there is this motif of worshiping a snake, it was okay. In the Old Testament, before Christ came, Moses had his people out in the wilderness, and some of them were bitten by, from what I understand, winged serpents. And so when Moses hung this snake, which is also a symbol of the caduceus, the medical symbol with the snakes that are wrapping themselves around this pole. It's the same thing. This is where it came from. That anybody that looked at it would be healed of the bites. So in this way, there's kind of a dichotomy of Christ and the snake, and that they're kind of the same thing when it comes to their place. And that's what the sword versus, and God's wrath versus Christ and his love being mixed together. And again, it goes back in the non-Christian sense of this union of opposites. It goes directly back prior to Christ and the Bible and everything else to other motifs that are older, that are ancient, but still the same underpinnings of our understanding of, man altogether. And again, that stretches back to what I said earlier about the 4 functions of myth. And that's the sociological validation and the maintenance of, a specific social order. So right now, people are still Christians and believing the Bible, where before in other cultures it was, Zeus and Hermes, which is also an allegory of Christ. Before then, that it's still the same stories and still the same ways that we understand ourselves. And that's why the World Tree is a symbol of man himself, and how we are able to identify the serpent below, which we all have inside, and the eagle above, which we all have inside, and how the union of those two things makes us who we are and how we go about life. So understanding symbols like this one, it's important because it teaches us who we are and who we have been. We're on this journey through our own DNA that's been passed from, generations and generations back. So there's part of that we carry with us that is a memory of who we are that we can't even remember anymore. This passing on of genetic material from antiquity. So why must things be symbolic? Well, the answer is that it's the language of the unconscious in all cultures, and it's unspoken in its own language. That's without a language that we can understand, because it's elemental, it's universal. Its rich symbols are from an era of man's primordial self. From before full consciousness, like we know now existed. Symbols and archetypes are ancient patterns of life that are only explained through access to the unconscious and through our understanding of what these precepts are. There are certain themes and motifs that occur everywhere. And Adolf Bastian called these things elementary ideas. It's another term for you to look up. He was a German anthropologist. And his idea of folk ideas, which were different, were geared more toward like local and less universal motifs or facts. And in Carl Jung's idea of archetypes, information that we understand and is interpreted through our nervous system, and is assimilated and interpreted by these foundational psychological components. And that's how we can better understand things, with the influx of our senses and how it lands on these motifs that predate our consciousness. And the World Tree can be symbolized in different forms. Doesn't necessarily have to be just a tree. It's just the tree carried the components that were needed to teach us about ourselves. More modern times it would have been like probably the Tower of Babel, or skyscrapers nowadays, really. A computer tower, it's still kind of the same search for knowledge that carries both good and evil. You could mythologize that in an equal way, and it would be no different, save for the sacrifice that had to be made at some point. And I don't really want to know what that's going to be right now. But you can see where these things land in your mind, like that there's this common occurrence, these parallels, that across time, they're different things, but it's the same story, that good and evil unite in the growth of this tree, and their divinity of life and love stands opposed, but it's also together. The tree would also be symbolized by the opus in alchemy, OPUS. And there's another allegory, that there's so many different ones that are so similar, and that's where I find that studies like comparative mythology and current religion and religions across time, people even today and will apparently, hopefully not forever, but man, it really seems like it, will kill each other because it's not the same story, but it's the same story, it's the same myth with different names or different instances, but it's this rich unconscious symbol of us, of ourselves, and working to understand who we are, and it gets contorted and turned into judgments, and it gets turned into fundamentalism and death, just because there's a difference in opinions on whose myth is better, when they're all myths and they're all the same, in different ways, that it harkens back to man in the cosmological function that I had mentioned before, that does change radically from time to time but remains the same. That this small size of the horizon is still no different, even though now we can travel all over the planet. Our myths seem to be compartmentalized, and it seems to be impenetrable from the outside, and if you dare question it, bad things will happen to you. That we keep this ego state among us, and we'll fight everybody else off at all costs because it threatens our existence some way. Speaking of those who will kill for their ideology, that ideology itself is the religion of man that keeps repeating the deaths of untold millions of people. I hate to end on such a sour note, but it's a very sobering, and it's a very, at the same time, enlightening and wonderful idea of man, and how we have the ability to be the snake gnawing at the roots, or the eagle on top knowing finally this individuation process, that we've been able to incorporate everything for the better of not just us but our offspring and those that come after us, and hopefully we can learn to do that across cultures. It's not going to happen for a while, I'm sorry to say, because we still have this this monkey like brain that just wants what it wants. It'll kill and it'll do all kinds of bad at all costs. But we do have this opposite side that seeks for a higher self. And so hopefully, eventually that evolution of who we are will take us closer to that, little by little. Well, again, thank you everyone for tuning in. It's always a wonderful time getting together. I've got some guests lined up for this summer, so I hope you are on board with staying with us. I again appreciate the time that you spend. I hope these podcasts are valid and are relevant for you, and that you can walk away with something. I always do when I'm doing research for these things. I think it's a blast being able to understand myself better, because we understand each other better as a result. So I will see you around. My next podcast should be with a guest, and we're hoping to get that one done here in the next few weeks. Again, check us out on Twitter or Facebook. You can check out our email, send us a message, tell us what you like, dislike, would like to look into. mindoutpodcast@gmail.com, or check out our Patreon page, become a subscriber, and don't forget to tell a friend.